I appeal to you, therefore, friends, by the mercies of God, to present your very selves to him as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Then you may prove what is the will of God for you, what is good and acceptable and mature. So Paul writes to his friends in Rome 2,000 years ago. The reporter approaches a woman obviously in great pain and distress over some tragedy, perhaps in her family, thrusts a microphone in her face and asks, "Quiz time." What does he ask? How do you feel? Has there ever been a culture as focused on feelings as ours is? Social commentator John Leo, in a column entitled "The Feel Be With You," writes, Tarzan and his ape mother appeared on Good Morning America last week in a scene from the new Disney animated movie Tarzan. The ape was warmly lecturing the boy. "Now forget what you see," she said. "What do you feel?" "My heart," replies Tarzan. He feels her heart too, and they hug. Tarzan is said to be a very good movie, and isolated scenes watched while brushing one's teeth at 8 a.m. probably shouldn't be overanalyzed. Still, I think the lovable step ape made a big mistake here. Listening to your heart is important, particularly in a Disney movie. But little Tarzan wouldn't last 2 days in the jungle if he forgot what he saw and merely consulted his feelings. More likely, the movie would end abruptly as Tarzan became a snack for some emotionally underdeveloped but visually alert predator who lacked a feelings-oriented advisor. We do, as a culture, seem preoccupied with our feelings, with whether we're feeling up, good, happy. Just listen to the talk shows. We're inclined to take our emotional temperature overmuch, I think. In some measure, this is what is driving the self-esteem movement, based on the assumption that kids who don't feel good about themselves will not perform well, will get in trouble, will not be good citizens. So California now spends $750,000 on a program to make self-esteem an official state goal. Sorry, folks, the only problem with all this is that now all kinds of hard research is in, and it indicates that there is really no correlation between the way people feel about themselves and how well they perform. Albert Bandura, one of a number of researchers, psychology professor at Stanford, concludes from extensive study that self-esteem affects neither personal goals nor performance. Some students feel terrible about themselves and become academic and social whizzes. Others brim with self-confidence and do awful work. In fact, the highest self-esteem in the studies is found by guess whom? Gang members. I refer you to a fascinating article in the New York Times Sunday magazine last week, in which researcher Lauren Slater indicates how therapists very often get trapped in the unrealistic expectation of their clients. So many seeking therapy expect to be helped to feel good. Now let me be clear. I believe in seeking help when you get stuck emotionally, have difficulty functioning. I spent 3 hard years training to be a therapist. But as Slater points out, the goal of therapy is not the alleviation of discomfort. It's to enable one to live a full and meaningful existence and not be ruled by one's emotional states. Slater writes, the self is not about how good it feels, but how well it does in work and love. Work and love. That's a phrase fashioned by Freud himself, who once said that the successful individual is the one who has achieved meaningful work and meaningful love. And note how separate from this sentence is any notion of the self. We blame Freud for a lot of things, but we can't blame that cigar-smoking Victorian for this particular cultural obsession. It was Freud, after all, who said that the job of therapy is to turn neurotic suffering into ordinary, everyday suffering. Freud never claimed that we should be always happy. And he never claimed that feeling good about yourself was the key to a life well lived, unquote. But you know, nowhere do we seem as focused on good feelings, I suspect, as in our religious activities, our spiritual quest. What do we want from faith, if not good feelings? What the Baptists I grew up with used to call a blessing. They'd leave the church on Sunday morning and said, I got a real blessing. Okay? And nothing wrong with that. Kathleen Falsano, though, writes this week that on the third floor of the Michigan Avenue Virgin Megastore, halfway between the classical music collection and the cafe, behind the display of Jennifer Lopez and NSYNC calendars, is the store's spirituality section. The giant Virgin Music and Media Store, she assures us, is a barometer for hipness in our town. Then she goes on to point out that as she examined that place, she discovered that of all the offerings on spirituality and contentment and good feelings, there's almost nothing from the Christian tradition, and there were no Bibles at all. So she asked a theology professor by the name of Tom Beaudoin why this was the case. And he responded, well, I think it's because all this is very experiential, this interest in spirituality. People talk about it in terms of what they are feeling, what they are sensing, what they are intuiting. So it's sort of something that can be cut and pasted from various sources, least of all the Bible. Now again, there's nothing wrong with feeling, emotional experience when it comes to our faith and worship. Indeed, without feeling, our life and faith would be a rather dull affair. Deep emotions are part of any rich and meaningful life. Marlene and I saw The Beautiful Mind the other night, and I was moved to tears. I can't imagine anybody who would not be. But you know, we did not decide to go to the movie in order to get a good feeling. Matter of fact, somebody told us it was a downer and we almost didn't go. When I turned to the biblical tradition, I noticed something. It never talks about the pursuit of happiness. It does not offer techniques in order to achieve good feelings. Of course it speaks of emotions, but most often it speaks of them as byproducts of some other focus and endeavor in life. Happy is the man whose delight is in the law of the Lord. He meditates on it night and day. Happy is the peacemaker. Happy is the merciful. Happy are those who mourn. When Paul writes to his friends in Rome, he asks for fundamentally two things of them. He asked, first of all, for surrender of their will to God. He appeals to them to give themselves to God as living sacrifices. This is to be the central thrust and concern of their lives. But what kind of psychological maneuver is that? Give yourself to God. John Calvin described it this way. We are not our own, so let not our reason nor our will sway our deeds and plans. We are not our own. Let us therefore not set it as our goal to seek what is expedient and comfortable for us. We are not our own, so in as far as we can, let us forget ourselves and all that is ours. We belong to God, let us therefore live for Him. We belong to God, so let His wisdom and will rule in all our activities. So what can and does this sort of inner surrender to a higher will and power do for us? Why is it so important? I think it enables priority and focus and perspective against the tendency in all of us to be torn this way and that, ambivalent about our desires, what comfort dictates, what the crowd asks of us. It enables us to keep at it on days when life becomes difficult and disagreeable. It enables us to say no to the desire to feel good all the time. Two guys. Ben has just come off the racquetball court, and Stan, who has arrived at the club to play tennis. Stan sees Ben and says, "Hi, buddy, what are you doing down here?" Ben, "Oh, just trying to stay in shape." Stan responds, yeah, I know what you mean. I'm supposed to meet a guy for tennis. Do you come here a lot? Ben says, about once or twice a week. I volunteered at church to spend some time with Travis. His stepdad died about a year ago, and he's having a hard time, but he seems to like racquetball, and he keeps me hopping. Stan says, that's great. You mean you just meet him here? Ben says, yeah, so far he'd rather play than talk, but he's starting to open up a little bit. I'm finding how tough life has been on him. Stan responds, that's great. You know, I ought to do something like that. Beth and I have talked about it, but we've never found anything that really fits us. You know what I mean? Sure, says Ben. I finally talked to my minister, and he gave me some ideas. Have you ever thought of working in the inner city? Stan says, well, I would, but well, you know, Beth and I would kind of like to do something together, and well, I don't feel too good about having her downtown. You know what I mean? It's just I wouldn't want to take any chances. Ben says, well, I can understand that. How about something in your own neighborhood? Remember how Bob was talking about having a block party and inviting all your neighbors? Stan says, yeah, but I don't know. He must have different neighbors than I do. My neighbors are kind of quiet. They don't like to be disturbed. Besides, I'd rather do something with really needy people. My neighbors don't seem to need much of anything. Ben says, well, I'm on the mailing list for the Crisis Pregnancy Center. They need people to do volunteer counseling. Stan, well, I don't know about that. That's such a volatile subject. Everybody disagrees on how to handle that. My life is stressful enough without all that controversy. I think I'd rather do something less revolutionary. You know what I mean? Ben says, I know what you mean. Of course, the church always needs Sunday school teachers or youth workers. You could really help out there. In fact, the youth group's going to Great America next week. Oh boy, I can't stand those roller coasters. I lose it every time. Besides, running all over the state with a bunch of kids, I don't know. Okay, says Ben, well, let me think. Have you thought about working with Habitat for Humanity, the group that takes volunteers and helps them build houses for people who normally never buy a house? They have these rallies once a month where a speaker comes in and Stan interrupts. Sounds pretty involved. Ben responds, well, not really. You can start by just working on a Saturday. Saturday we're going to the zoo with the kids. Well, not this Saturday, some other Saturday. Well, we're pretty busy on weekends, really. I don't know how we could. Ben interrupts. Look, you don't have to make excuses for me. You said you wanted to get involved somewhere, so I was simply trying to give you some ideas. If you don't want to do anything, Stan interrupts. It's not that I don't want to do anything. I do. We really do. It's finding something that fits us. Ben responds, okay, let me get this straight. All you need is a kind of service that is in a safe environment, with people like you, but that doesn't disturb anybody, is cheap, non-controversial, involves no risk and very little time commitment. Is that about right? Give yourself as a living sacrifice. At least it gives some clarity and priority and purpose about our lives. No matter how we feel, we ought to live them for God and His will. Someone has said, most of the real contributions to our world are made by people who are not feeling particularly well at the time. It's a hard but necessary truth that none of us would mount to much as human beings, would grow into people of inner integrity and caring if we were concerned with feeling good all the time. We do not develop inner resources, learn staying power, generate courage and hope and purpose without some effort to give, to sacrifice, which in my dictionary says to hurt. This is why I'm always suspicious of education theories that argue that we should make all education fun. We don't need to go looking for trouble to acknowledge that it has been precisely the unpleasant and the strenuous times in our lives when we didn't feel particularly good that have made us what we are, that have developed patience and fortitude and staying power, provided, of course, that we embrace these difficult days and learn from them, which leads us to the second thing that Paul asks of his friends: engage your mind. Let yourselves be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you can test and be sure of the will of God for you, what is good and acceptable and mature. How do we know what the will of God is to which we are to surrender our wills? We use our heads. We think. God does not order us around. He does not strike us with lightning. We dedicate our lives to Him and then set out to imagine what that might involve for our personal lives. There's an old rabbinic tale about God's first encounter with Adam in the garden. Adam's just fine, but he has one question. God, here I am, beautiful place, and she, of course, but what's the meaning of it all? What's the meaning of my life? God says, it has to have a meaning? Sure, says Adam. God replies, well, I'm sure you'll think of something. That's about right, you know. In the light of what we know about God and Jesus of Nazareth and committed to serve His will, we use our God-given intelligence to figure out what that concretely might mean in our own life. You realize that even Jesus did not have a direct pipeline, and time again he has to go off into the hills to try and figure out where he's headed next. Some years ago, John Gardner of Stanford concluded a speech with a paragraph on the meaning of life. The speech was reprinted over the years. 15 years later, that final paragraph came back to him in a rather dramatic way, really a heartbreaking way. A man wrote to me from Colorado saying that his 20-year-old daughter had been killed in an automobile accident some weeks before, that she was carrying in her billfold a paragraph from a speech of mine. He said he was grateful because that paragraph and the fact that she kept it close to her told him something that he might otherwise not have known about her values and concerns. And I can't imagine where and when she came across the paragraph, but here it is. Meaning is not something you stumble across like the answer to a riddle or a prize in a treasure hunt. Meaning is something you build into your life. You build it out of your own past, out of your loyalties, out of the experience of humankind as it is passed on to you, out of your own talent and understanding, out of the things you believe in, out of the values for which you are willing to sacrifice. The ingredients are there, and you're the only one who can put them together into that unique pattern which will be your life. But above all, let it be a life that has dignity and meaning for you. Joe Ehrman played defensive tackle for the Baltimore Colts back when there were Baltimore Colts. Last I knew, he was teaching in Baltimore's inner city. How did he get from gridiron to that goal? I always thought I'd find great meaning and purpose in being a professional football player, he says. I always believed if I could get enough sacks, if my team could do well enough, if my contract would get big enough, it would all come together. But it never came together. I had a brother, Billy, who was 10 years younger than I was, and I taught him my values. If you want to be somebody, Billy, you got to make it in sports. He was working as a ball boy for the Colts, and one day the trainer noticed that he had black and blue marks on his chest, sent Billy to the hospital where he was diagnosed with cancer. For the next 5 months, Joe cared for his dying brother and reassessed his beliefs. He says this is really the first time that he ever examined what he believed about the purpose of his life. Joe remembers after the last amen of the memorial service and everybody else had left, I was still standing by the grave with that question nagging in my mind. What is the purpose of my life? Here I was, 28 years old, my 7th year in the NFL, and I didn't have a clue. Then a simple thought came to me. Why should I not attempt in the years ahead to become the kind of person that I think God would like me to be, doing what I think He would want me to do? The simple thought was exhilarating, like being connected in a meaningful new way to the universe. And it was a whole new lease on life. Well, it can mean renewing our mind, can mean making some changes in our lives, what we do with our days, maybe a little less television, maybe a little more caring. Or it can mean simply learning to see and do what we're already doing, but from a different perspective. For me, it makes all the difference in the world whether I see the tasks and relationships of this day as realities that I'm stuck with, or I see them as tasks and relationships filled with the will of God for my life. To live convinced in my mind that in and through the labors and responsibilities of each day, I am giving my life to God, I am doing what He wants me to do. This can give life, I find, a freedom and focus and energy, and even at times a good feeling like no other. Feel good? Not every day, but enough, you bet.